Hi, and welcome to this World City event with me, Laura Laker, and Chris Boardman, who is an Olympic gold medal cyclist turned cycling and walking commissioner for Greater Manchester. Chris has been in the role since 2017, in which time he's presided over plans to build a 1,800-mile cycling and walking network known as the B Network. And that will connect every neighbourhood in the city with walking and cycling routes. So it's a big plan, Chris, and we're here to talk about it. Manchester is England's second largest or second most populous urban area. And we're going to talk about why, when it comes to changing our streets, bigger is better. Now, I don't know about you, but I heard the words fireside chat and I was expecting a fire.
Well, I could start one if you like.
So you've had quite an interesting career, some of which involved woodwork, and it's sort of led you via being a professional athlete, working in the sport of cycling, in development of technology, to this role as cycling and walking commissioner in Manchester. Do you want to just talk about?
Well, I think it's very kind of you to call it a career. I think I've just done stuff that I've bumped into, and to start with, I had a fascination with how to be better riding a bike and all the ingredients that made that up. And then I went to work for British Cycling on the other side of the fence as one of the senior management team and ran the R&D program, so making more stuff. So while I was doing that, and the Great British Cycling team got very successful, I found myself at the 2012 Olympic Games and lots of medals being won. It was great. And I ended up being volunteered to go on Newsnight to give, so, in the UK, there's a big political program, really, and to give an update on what's happening in the Olympic Games. So I went and did that part, and it was quite a curious setting for me, and they'd just been talking about the Greek financial crisis, and I was quite willing to get stuck into that, but they wouldn't let me because I didn't have a tie. So when we got towards the end of the interview about the Olympic Games itself, I was asked some pretty stock questions that are in the media about, so cycling, if it gets really popular, do you think cyclists should pay road tax? And I just happened to know that, well, actually, that was abolished in 1936, 37, I think, and now we just pay an emissions charge, so cyclists don't emit any fumes, so they don't pay. And there was just a few stereotypes that got thrown out, and it was quite irritating that something was good and somebody felt for balance, we'll have to pick holes in it. And that was pretty much where I started to get sucked into the world of advocacy. And then I spent several years working with British Cycling on the political side, so going to lobby ministers and just looking at this mountain of evidence for using bikes to get around. And I became passionate about that side of it.
And then you were on that side for a while, weren't you, as an advocate and very good at it. And then at some point you were asked to go on the other side and actually deliver something. So Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester.
I talked myself into a corner, really, in that I've been lobbying ministers and talking about all this tremendous energy, because using bikes to get around as a form of transport, it is the most wonderfully robust soapbox to stand on, because there is pretty much no crisis in the world that's threatening us right now that can't be positively affected by changing the way that we move about, changing our short journeys to just get out of a car and give us options to do it. And so whenever you went to see anybody or speak on television, it was always an easy one to a cause to champion. And eventually we realised that we're just not making any inroads because it's political will to do stuff that in the short term is not necessarily going to be popular. People will see it as you taking away a right to drive, and so it was going to be difficult, and there wasn't an appetite to do that. So we were a little bit down in the dumps and in our little headquarters at British Cycling. And one of my colleagues, Kirsty McCaskill-Baxter, used to work with Andy Burnham when he worked in government, Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and she happened to know that he'd just become mayor of Greater Manchester, so the 10 boroughs of the whole region. And he said, he needs a cycling commissioner, and I think it should be you, and I'm going to ring him up. So she did. And Andy gave me a ring and said, would you take on this job? I'm genuinely serious that we need to change the way people travel. Will you take the job? And I agreed without realising just how big a job that it actually was.
And I guess maybe true to form in your career, you decided that you weren't going to kind of do things by half. You wanted to do it properly.
Well, I'd learned something right back, and this is going to sound a bit weird, in a wind tunnel that was really important for changing the way people travel in a whole city region. And it was, I had an experience with the R&D program where we designed this wonderful equipment for an Olympic team and all the clothing, and we'd found some marvelous things with our secret little test team. And then I went to the athletes and gave it to them and said, right, go and use this. And I remember one qualifying event for the Olympic Games, and I went and sat in the stands and I watched the athletes, and 80% of them kept doing exactly what they were doing before. And I couldn't believe it. I had all this evidence, and I'd given you this stuff, and it was going to make you go faster. And they weren't using it. And in my ignorance and arrogance at the time, I'd completely missed the fact that these people had been working blood, sweat, and tears to do it right their way for so long. And then somebody stepped in at the last minute and said, oh, just don't do that, do it this way. 20% of people had used all of the equipment and clothing, and they were the athletes that had helped us with the experiments. And sort of the light bulb went on. So we got all of the athletes of the wind tunnel, put them in there. We cut a hole in the ceiling, had a projector that just gave them live information in whatever language they chose. It might be the time saved in their particular event. Bear with me, this is going somewhere. And we just let them play and didn't tell them anything. And then after a while, we said, why don't you just move your arms a bit? And they moved, and they could see the change. And they went, oh, that's better. And then we'd hand them a piece of equipment or a piece of clothing. And by the end of the session with each athlete, they pretty much adopted what we'd wanted them to do in the first place. But now this wasn't our information. It was theirs. And that was such a powerful lesson for me about it doesn't, my job, if I'm going to lead well, is not to come up with the best answer. It's to come up with the best question. Because whatever it comes out the other side belongs to the client, the athlete, whoever it might be that you're working with, the counsellor in this case. So double all the way back around to Greater Manchester. When I started, I set up meetings in each of the 10 districts and said, right, we don't have to do any of this. That's entirely your choice. But I've just been given a big chunk of cash by the mayor to change the way people travel, and we'll only spend it on stuff that makes a difference. So if you're interested, just let's have a meeting. You choose who's in the room, blank piece of paper, or rather a blank map of your area, and you hold the pen, figuratively and literally hold the pen. And it just started with, you tell me where you can't go with, if you were pushing a double buggy. So that became one of our two really important standards at the start. Parent pushing a double buggy, because people could relate to that. And any cycling infrastructure usable and want to be used by a competent 12-year-old. So something people go, okay, I get that. Tell me where you wouldn't go, and they drew on the map. And then we said, okay, well, these roads are quiet then. You haven't marked those. Oh, yeah, they're quiet. Well, why don't you use them? Oh, because you get to the end of the road. Okay, so if we got you across there, would you use all of those roads? Yes. How about if we get you across the next one? Yes. We'll just put marks there. And then in the space of an hour and a half, they stood back, and you could see the light bulb go on when we've just designed a network. And in an hour and a half, they designed for each borough, same experience. They designed a network for their area. And then I asked, is it okay if we take these away and join them up and put them online as a draft? Not give it to a consultant for a few £100,000 in 2 years, but put it online as a draft and just ask everybody else what they think. And they were pretty nervous, but given their due, they had the courage to do that, and they put it online. And we had 4,000 comments in a month. And the most negative comment we had was, where's ours? And so it went from 1,500 miles when it was all joined together to 1,800 miles. And we never touched a pen. And I think that was absolutely critical at the start. We never touched a pen. We gave it to the people who were going to have to live there, who were going to have to fight for it. And I think that was a really interesting way to do it that worked, and I would imagine would work anywhere in the world.
And do you think that, I mean, obviously that's a great example of how you've learned that people need to have ownership over something. They need to try stuff and see how it works. I'm wondering, because the engagement part is a huge using the language that people can understand and talking about the double buggy and talking about, which routes can't you use and which can you use. There's a lot of psychology there, really, isn't it? It's not necessarily about changing something. It's about getting people kind of to understand and to agree. And
Well, I think what I've learned on the fascinating journey, I'm certainly not going to call it a career, as I've gone along, is it all boils down to human beings and basic psychology. And evidence is really important, but it's something you need to have. You kind of can't go forward without it if you want change, but just forget about it. Don't talk about it all the time. Use it very sparingly, because it's not how we make decisions. And we've got a wonderful little picture, which I hope we can flash up now. And it just shows this is human beings. This is us. It doesn't matter how nice a path we build around the outside. I am going to do the easiest thing for me right now, even if I know it's to my own detriment eventually. And we ignore that fact at our peril. And so when we're talking about people changing the way that they live, changing, just getting out of the car, we have to talk. It's got to be easy. It's got to look appealing, and it's got to feel safe. And if it's not those three things, don't waste your money, because why would I get out of the car? Yeah. And I think so. The evidence for getting out of the car at the political level in Greater Manchester, very similar to lots of parts of the world, the United States, certainly other parts of the UK. There was a third of households don't have a car at all. And we don't think about that. And we just make it easier to drive a car. And we've done it to such an extent that we have 250 million car journeys every year in our region that are less than 1 kilometre, which is both embarrassing and also quite exciting. Just look how little we actually have to change. So at a political level, that's the reason, and the connotations of that financially are huge. For this just one city region, 3.7 billion a year it costs us to travel like that, in terms of health, in terms of pollution, in terms of congestion, all of the things that creates traveling like that. And so there's good evidence to unpick it. But when the person who has to change is Joe Public, then they have to see what's in it for me because of that muddy path thing. They've got to see it, and they've got to see it quickly. And so the only thing to talk to that audience about is why it's easy, why it saves me money, why it's nicer for me and my family. Because if we don't do that, I'm not getting out the car.
Yeah, because we all know that we have problems in cities. It's air pollution, it's congestion, it's, we're not getting enough exercise, people are isolated from their communities. And the solution, transport plays a huge role in all of these issues. But like you say, it's about getting people to want to change, and I guess kind of empowering them to.
Well, I think that one of the ways, another psychological element we used at the start. So that whole mapping exercise was about giving ownership to people, and it was also making it region wide. So make it big, because if you want to do some crossings or some smaller things, it's cheap and it's easy, and it's not newsworthy, and it's not something I can feel proud of. But if you're going to do 20,000 crossings and you're going to make the country's largest cycling network, if you stitch that all together, all of these people feel good and proud. This is us. We're leading the country in this regard. And that's really important. If you want to get people to do something that's not going to be easy in the short term, then give them some reasons to do it. And I feel good about myself because we're doing this and nowhere else in the country is. And then you can bring it right back down to those crossings or that little bit of cycle path. And I can see where it fits in this big plan. And it's a message that you have to keep reinforcing. But I think it's so important to make it big. And on a political level, what a £1.5 billion programme is something that makes national news, and politicians can use that to draw down cash and to get government to invest when people are telling them 1,000 things. And how do you cut through? I can only hear 10 things. How do I make my thing one of those 10? Make it big. Yeah. You don't make it small.
Yeah. And I was going to say, it's about empowering the region as well, because, in the UK, we talk about a north-south divide, and we've seen that with COVID, and we've seen it with investment in all sorts of areas. But this plan is something to be proud of as a city and as an area, and it's a way that Manchester, I guess, is looking to the future.
Yeah, everybody wants to be able to say, look, we're leading the way. And leading is it's hard because you bump into all the nasty stuff first, and you have to be the ones that provide the proof for other people, and it's not easy. So there's got to be some real compelling reasons for people to put up with that pain, and making something really big, excuse me, is really important. Each step can then be seen as a step to getting somewhere. It's not just about this one thing. And when you do meet resistance, and you will, when you're taking this parking space from outside my shop, then you can context that pain in a wider game that makes it worth the pain.
Yeah, and COVID has obviously made a lot of the problems and a lot of the solutions more acute. Can you talk us through
Yeah,
what's happened?
just to finish up on the ownership thing. I mentioned very briefly cash. So we dedicated. So Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, said, right, I'm ring fencing £160 million to get this going, and it can only be spent, and he owns the rules. And my rules were, it's got to meet this 12-year-old standard, and it must meet a double buggy standard. And if it doesn't, we don't fund it. If you don't want to do it, that's fine. But we're not building it badly because we're not wasting any more cash. And I think that you could call it a carrot and stick approach for each of the 10 boroughs was, listen, we can do this properly and you can have something great, but you don't have to. I'm not telling you to do anything. It's your borough. And that kicks into another human psychology, or an aspect of psychology, just the simple fear of missing out. And if the neighbours are doing all of these things and they've got £30 million worth of schemes and they're in the newspaper and I'm not, I feel bad. So I think that's a healthy competitiveness as well, and to stick to that has been important.
A bit more positive, isn't it? What are we getting versus?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's healthy competition for the right thing. We didn't just say we're going to divvy this money up equally for each of the 10 districts, because it was all about quality. And if I'd run out of cash, in fact we did, we're over programmed, we've got more schemes than we can afford at the moment, but that's a great place to be when you're trying to do something like it. It says there's an appetite for it. We have customers there, which means I can turn around to government and say, listen, this is the change you want to see, and they're delivering it. Give me some more, because the point of me being in Greater Manchester is to create an example on such a scale. It is unignorable nationally. So it's in your interest, Boris Johnson, to help me get this done.
Yeah,
and that was the point.
Yeah, and Boris Johnson did exactly the same thing in London. He had a 913 odd million pound plan, and you were there the day that it launched, and he rode along the Victorian Bank, which is now a protected cycleway, and he said, we're going to do this massive plan, and he didn't have the money at the time. It was all about talking it up, and then the money comes along later once people believe in it.
And the benefits, you start to be able to prove your point. And frankly, if we can't, then we shouldn't be doing it. If it doesn't improve health, reduce congestion, reduce pollution, give people other options, people prefer it. If it can't do those things, then we shouldn't be doing it. But when you have a product like cycling and walking that makes a nicer place to live, and you have evidence dotted about that other people aren't looking at, you can see that wherever this has been done, people prefer it. Take anybody from the UK and stand them on the street in Denmark, and you watch 60% of kids ride to school every day and say, right, which would you prefer? Everyone says that. So that no one has a problem with the destination, but the journey can be rough to get there as you change. The COVID situation, to come back to the question you asked about 5 minutes ago, has been fascinating. And I really hesitate to use the term opportunity around something where people are dying in the country. But we would be crazy to ignore what this situation has given us in terms of a chance to try using our streets differently. So back in March, looking at it from a transport perspective, we effectively turned off global traffic. And in doing so, we inadvertently launched what was essentially a global trial on how we use our streets. And so everybody's like stopped driving for all the reasons that we know. And then we had key workers who had to move about, and they had to get to hospitals and shops to make sure we have food and all of those things. Now, a lot of those people don't have cars. In fact, about a third of the UK doesn't have cars. It goes up in dense city areas, and they rely on public transport. And now they're not allowed to use it, or the trains aren't running on time. And for all of those reasons, They started to pull bikes out of garages and pump up the tyres or replace the inner tubes and use that to get about. And they liked it. And we found that parents who were either bored or needed exercise or had bored kids, they all went out on bikes as well. And our street started filling up with people just moving around on foot, and particularly by bike, because they had this quiet space and they felt safe. And so they were using it. So we saw traffic volumes drop, all modes, between 60 and 90% in the UK. And cycling went up by DFT's own figures, Department for Transport, in England by nearly 300% on pre-COVID levels. So we ostensibly just proved that if you make people feel safe, whatever the reason, they will ride bikes to get around. And so very quickly we have a short-term reason, a moral obligation to help the people who don't have a car to get around. And while that's happening, while we make sure as traffic's come back, and it has, that we save safe space for them to move about without having to get on a bus or a train when they're overcrowded, then it lets us all try travelling differently. And even if we don't like it, we can tweak it. And after a few months, we can say, listen, does this work for us? And if the answer is yes, we can keep it. So we're in I don't want to use sort of cliches, but this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. At least I certainly hope so. It is a situation we will almost never have again. And it's up to us to choose what we do with it.
Yeah, it was amazing, wasn't it? Even in areas that you don't see people cycling normally, the roads are too dangerous. You see people, families out on bikes, people running who obviously haven't run in a long time, people walking in the street. And I think it did change a lot of people's perceptions and did create this sort of experiment and get us to think about how we use our streets in a way that we haven't before, I guess, in the same way as your athletes.
Well, I did a feature about 3 or 4 years ago in Copenhagen. Actually, no, sorry. I worked cover the Tour de France for ITV, and we found ourselves in Utrecht for the start of one of the stages. And I was allowed to go out and do a little piece on, look at this place. You know, everybody's moving around and they're doing it without cars, and it's nice. And I think at the end of the piece, I said, I've been out and I've seen thousands of people moving around by bikes, but I haven't seen a single cyclist. I've just seen normal people in normal clothes doing normal things without cars. And I think that's what we've experienced through spring and summer this year, is people realise that cycling isn't an identity. It's just a way of getting around without a car. And people do it. Anybody can do it. And I think that experience could help us a huge amount now as we start to think about the even bigger crisis of climate change, which hasn't got away. It's just sitting there. And now we have more people who've had an experience. And I think 94% of them, recent poll was showing 94% of people who said that they rode a bike during lockdown said, I intend to keep going. I intend to do more of this. And that's a pretty big number.
So this year's Tour de France, you also did a piece about some temporary infrastructure that had gone in sort of during the COVID crisis.
I've ridden some special bikes in my career, and it's no secret that I love a bit of tech. So it might come as a surprise to some that my favourite bikes this year are rusty, dusty, and often punctured. The ones that live in the dark corners of garages, unloved, or at least they were, until cycling went viral.
Around the world, as workplaces and public spaces shut, traffic was effectively turned off, and the resulting change to our urban landscape inadvertently launched a planet-wide consultation on using our streets differently.
Suddenly, the air felt cleaner because we could hear birds. But most importantly, that low-level sense of unease had gone. We felt safe on our streets. And as a consequence, we started venturing out.
One survey showed that until they were absent, more than half the population hadn't even realised the negative effect noise and air pollution had been having on their lives. And incredibly, nearly half of those surveyed who lived in the capital heard birdsong for the first time. Whether to get to work, to exercise, to alleviate boredom, or to entertain restless kids, whatever the reason, people started taking to two wheels in their droves. Indeed, government figures showed that across England alone, bike use rose by more than 380%. At the same time, all other forms of transport had dropped by up to 90%. City bosses around the world realised that this trend was not just good for the mental and physical health of a locked-down population. If people continued to keep doing what they were currently enjoying, they were staring at a cheap and fast solution to some of their biggest and most expensive problems. Rome, Milan, New York, in fact most of the world's important conurbations, started frantically clearing a path for people to ride. And the one this race is currently wending its way towards is arguably leading the pack. Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo was already on this mission, but COVID gave her a legitimate reason to step even harder on the pedal. In April, the city leader announced 650 kilometres of cycle lanes would quickly be put in place, and further pledged that every street in the capital would become cycle-friendly by 2024. In the UK, Boris Johnson, who's got past form for cycle lanes, was also keen to get in on the act.
We'll have thousands of miles of protected lanes, £50 vouchers to help people get their old bikes done up again, cycle training, help with electric bikes. And what I also want to see is more work done to get motorists to understand that we are all going to be sharing the roads, you're going to be sharing it with cyclists, so be respectful, be courteous.
With emergency funding on offer, councils across the UK started nervously reconfiguring streets, reallocating space to ensure those without cars, a full quarter of all UK households, had a safe way to make essential journeys. And at the same time, giving all of us a chance to try travelling under our own steam.
One of the places that's chosen to turn distancing requirements into a community-enhancing experience is Blackrock Village in Ireland.
They recognised that by making their high street one-way and giving over parking spaces to people, they could create a place that wasn't only COVID safe, but was somewhere the townsfolk wanted to linger. In just 8 weeks, they've made a space children and families who wouldn't normally dream of cycling in this busy centre felt comfortable enough to pedal to shops and cafes. In one fell swoop, they'd made bike use a normal part of everyday life.
We'd be insane not to recognise that in the midst of this terrible time, the bicycle has given us something wonderful, both to watch and to do, something wholly positive. And I, for one, sincerely hope that it continues to be highly infectious, because in this case, the malady is also the cure.
And of course, as part of these temporary routes that have gone in, there's been some resistance to it, and it's happened in Manchester, it's happened in cities all around the world. And I'm wondering how you kind of deal with those objections, because for all of the good that cycling does, there's always going to be someone who doesn't like change.
Culture change is always two things. It's always painful and it's always slow. And you need to expect that, and you need to plan for it, because it will happen. You will not have everybody happy, and somebody who's being asked to change who simply doesn't want to, and that will be in the region of 10 to 20% of people, they can make a lot of noise. And we talk about the vocal minority, and they're the ones that get headlines. And so it sounds like a lot more people than it is, but it does sound like a lot more people than it is, and it makes politicians very uncomfortable, and it gets a lot of coverage. Mm-hmm. And so it is always going to be there. It is a standard, but we have, in this case, a good product. If we have political will to see it through, if you start asking, rather than asking why should we do it, start asking, okay, we're going to do it, how do we do it? Then it becomes very different. So the messaging around temporary measures, which every conurbation in the UK has been asked to do, in fact they've been instructed to do by government, and government has funded it. We've made it very much about giving people a safe way to travel, and our messaging around those temporary measures, which are often just cones at the side of the road, just creating more space and having to take it away from people driving to create space for people to ride bikes, is often just says thank you. Thank you for making space for people who don't have the option to get in a car, and messages that remind people what this space is for. How effective it is, I mean, this is all so fresh now, we don't know because we're right in the middle of it. But going down the line of I need to speak the language of the people that have to change. If I'm in a car and I'm in a traffic jam, and this is normally a 2-lane road, and one of these lanes has been taken away from me, and I'm angry because I can't see many people in it, or it looks empty to me, and I'm in this traffic jam, what would make me okay about that? And if it's for cyclists, then there's a group I can focus in on, and it's selfish, and look, nobody's using it. And that's quite an easy thing to do because we start with an emotion, and then we look for reasons to justify that emotion, particularly anger. And so it's easy to find pseudo-logical reasons. But if I tell you that this space isn't for cyclists, this is for nurses and shopkeepers and people who don't have a car, and we need them to use trains and buses and trams less. So this space is for them. And we do it with simple pictures, and we do it by saying, thanks, I recognise that this is holding you up. So I'm saying thank you for giving me that space. It takes a lot of the heat out of that anger. So it's an experiment in progress because we've never been here before. No one has been here before. And I think I'm a great believer that this approach, I think, has a good chance of success.
Yeah, I think it's kind of created a bit of a two tiers of I think a lot of politicians basically they've either stayed with it or they've gone back and said this is probably a bit too much for me.
Well, we suddenly need, I mean, we need PR companies and publicists. They're the people that we aren't engaging now. We're using planners and local leaders and councillors. And the councillor may, spend most of their time working in a shop or as a locksmith or as a baker. And this is something they do part-time. They're not awesome communicators. And suddenly they need to be. And so when somebody has just said, listen, you're taking these parking spaces from outside my shop for this cycle lane, and they're ranting in my ear, that's really hard for them to stand up to because they don't have the tools to do it. And that's why this really needs to be government-led. And it needs to be culture change. The whole point of having a national government is that they're the ones that set a direction. Locally, you decide how to implement that direction, but a national government sets policy. And they've gone, in the UK, they've gone 2/3 of the way to doing that. They're looking at changes to regulations, which is great. They put some money behind it, which is great. And then the messaging at the moment has just stopped. And that's the bit where I think we've got to get it right, and we've got to get it right very quickly.
With cycling, it seems like cities are leading the way, basically. It's not national governments that are doing bold things for active travel, for cycling, walking. It's city leaders. It's Mayor Anne Hidalgo in Paris. It's it's city leaders in the UK who are doing stuff, and it doesn't seem to be happening outside of that remit at national level.
The fear of missing out thing can be an individual, or it can be a whole town, or it can be a country. It can be on any scale you like. But when you get somebody who pushes for it, like Anne Hidalgo, and said, right, well, I'm going to make Paris cycle friendly. It's going to be hundreds of kilometres in. It's going to be in a few years' time. Here's pictures of before and after, and look at how much people are enjoying it. And I'm doing our bit for climate change, which is a big pressure for all global governments. And it makes everybody else feel really uncomfortable and feel like, first of all, they want to be just seen to keep up. And then people start looking for ways to actually keep up. So you need those key opinion leaders to make that change and to take that pain and take that political risk. And I think in the UK, we're on the verge of doing that at the moment. And the fact that Paris has done it has an impact on more than the people that just live in Paris.
Yeah, because it gets people excited, doesn't it? When Milan were one of the first cities to start doing temporary stuff, and everyone was talking.
Well,
about that.
Each city wants to be seen to lead, and so it's quite hard to find something to lead at that you can do at scale now. And this is one that is a force for good. As we said right at the start of this interview, it's a very sturdy soapbox to stand on. And if you can package it right and get enough people to go with you, then everybody starts to make it theirs. So things like smoking, when smoking was banned in the UK in all public places. To start with, that was resistance. You're taking something away, and then there was a moment when you got the majority, and suddenly it became everybody's, and the minority were the people who wanted to keep doing that. So, and I think cycling in particular could go that way as well, but it needs somebody or leaders in the UK to push through that first bit, because it is going to be painful.
Yeah, maybe in the same ways that we think back to when we went into pubs and we came out and our hair and clothes stank of smoke. We'll look at our residential streets in, I don't know, a year or two's time and think, why did we ever let people drive through here on their way to somewhere else? How much better it is now.
Well, creating examples. I mean, another thing that's happening through COVID is you have the ability to create examples. So low traffic neighbourhoods is a very cheap and very quick way to do this. So basically just stop people rat running through community streets that have been allowed to be the pressure valve for the main roads and fill up. So, you know, it's the unintended consequences of sat-nav, which you go, oh, great, I've got this device that tells me where to go, and it even knows what the traffic's doing. So if this road's full up, it'll divert me onto another road. So on the macro level, that's great for me. But it's actually allowed us to increase, was it about 10 million increase in cars over the last 10 years, and not notice, because the main roads have stayed full up and sat-navs have filled up the side roads. So it's really hard to get out of that now. So low traffic neighbourhoods is the obvious way to do it. Nobody wants cars running through the streets. The challenge, of course, is you push all that traffic back onto the main roads, and it does cause congestion. And so we're exposing the problem, really, by addressing a symptom. We're exposing the real cause. And so we're about to enter, or are entering, a really sticky phase. But if we can get enough low traffic neighbourhoods in, really, the outrage should be, where's ours? You know, I'm living next door to you, and it shouldn't be, don't do that, you're pushing the traffic onto my road. The next argument we want to cultivate, really, is, well, let's help you argue for doing the same thing where you live, and then help you with and then we can start to join up. So if you look back through history, examples is the way that we change, but it has to be an example that I can relate to. I don't talk about Denmark and the Netherlands much at all in my work, because that's over there, and it might only be 300 miles away, but it's over there, and I can't relate to it. It's too big a gap. And to a large degree, I can't relate to Cambridge or Oxford, other places in the UK, Waltham Forest. But I can relate to the next borough to me, and I can definitely relate to the next street. So they need to be close to home for me to really understand it and get it. And we need to accept that 20% of the people are never going with you. It's a noise that's always going to be there, and so just accept it. There's nothing you can do about that.
Yeah, and we've seen from other places where they've made changes that sometimes the noisiest opponents end up loving the schemes. And so your next stage in Manchester, you've recently announced, after 2 years in the post, you've got to the stage now where you've got 55 miles that you're going to deliver by the end of next year, and 140 crossings. So that's a big kind of deadline.
Well, it sounds, I mean, the most important bit is really, I want the truth to be out there. So we spent the first 2 years mobilising, because the boring bit that doesn't get in the headlines is, I need planners and I need engineers and I need to have consultations organised, and all of these things, all of these tools need to be created. You need to mobilise to be able to deliver a network that spans an entire region, and that takes time. In fact, 2 years is pretty quick. And we started getting the plans out and the renderings out there to show people what this could look like, and it got lots of headlines. And then there was this quiet period when you had to go and get what you needed to make it real. And we're just at the point now when we can say, right, by the end of next year, we will have 55 miles of this done. We'll have spent £85 million. And that's really important. It's important for the public to refresh and remind them this is the mission that we were on, remember, and it's real and it's happening. But also internally in councils and local government, to be able to say, right, that's when we said we'd do this by, and we agreed to go public with that because we think it's doable. We now have really got to do it, or we're going to get backlash. So it's a positive pressure. But I'm a real believer that you just need the truth out there, and then you can all look at it and decide what it is. 55 miles is a big number, but in reality, we need to be delivering 200 miles a year. So we've got to go a lot faster. So the plans are already pushing for how can we go further than that the next year and the next year.
Wow, that's a lot. It is a big big deadline, a big kind of a goal that you have. But I guess that fits with our theme, bigger is better, and perhaps a nice place to.
Well, it's if you when I worked back in sport, and there was a term that was coined early in the success of British cycling's renaissance around 2008, the aggregation of marginal gains. So big things are made up of small things. So we talk about the big thing and we go, wow, this is great. And then you can go down into the granular detail and go, well, we could do that little thing better, and we can do that little bit better. Or, well, these crossings, we had those scheduled in for next year, but we can do, why can't we do it this year? You start asking slightly different questions of why can't we, or how can we, not should we. That's the question you need to take out, because you can find a million reasons to not do something. But if you decide the answer is this is happening in a year's time, then all of your questions are how do we do that? And it's a wholly different mindset. It's much more positive and it's much more productive. And it's not one that local government is used to, because local government's main goal is to don't change anything. But we're in a period now with climate crisis, transport crisis, that we have no choice. So you may as well grasp it and make it a positive experience.
Well, thank you, Chris. Big plans in Manchester. I wish you all the best with it, and I look forward to maybe coming up and trying out some of your new routes when they're done by the end of next year.
Thank you very much.